Honduras revives the idea of the charter city, free market enclaves where corporations can operate virtually under their own rules. Is it a bold economic opportunity or 21st century colonialism? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The Charter City is back on the agenda in Honduras. The idea is to create at least two so-called super cities that, although on Honduran land, would be planned and run by private companies and free to make up their own laws. Its backers say the scheme would attract investment on a huge scale and create business-friendly enclaves similar to Hong Kong and Singapore. However, opponents of the plan have raised many concerns. They say it would violate labor rights, civil rights, the environment and the Constitution. In fact, last year, the original bill to allow construction of the cities was ruled unconstitutional by Honduras's Supreme Court. But Congress, dominated by the ruling party, subsequently voted to sack 4 of the judges who were against the project, and that has helped clear the legal obstacles. In addition, although the proposed sites for the cities are often described as unpopulated, much of it belongs to the country's Garifuna community, who do not expect prosperity, but displacement.
The special development regions are created in order to attract high value-added services and industries to the country. They can be used to accommodate the needs of one or more industry clusters. There will be at least 2 of them. They will be developed as private-public partnerships. Their size will vary. Ideally, they will cover an area between 200 to 1,000 square kilometers. They will be established in isolated and unpopulated areas where urban infrastructures, ports, and airport facilities can be built. The special development regions will issue their own rules, more efficient and investment-friendly than the ones used today in the rest of the country. The rules applicable in these regions will incorporate the best practices available today for each of the different industries that decide to operate in this area. Each special development region will be governed by a charter with unlimited duration. The charter will be approved by a supermajority of the Honduran Congress. Each charter can only be amended, changed, or repealed if it's authorized by the people living in the special development region. As a public-private partnership, investors can be involved in the drafting of the charter to make sure international standards are met. The special development region will enjoy a high degree of autonomy, including the authority to appoint their own administration, their own judges, and their own police force. All those officials will be appointed in an open and competitive process that guarantees the selection of the best persons.
To discuss the proposals for charter cities in Honduras are in the studio economist and political commentator Maricruz McGowan. From Vancouver, Karen Spring, a human rights activist who specializes on Honduras with the group Rights Action. And from Kansas City, William Black, professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri. Maricruz McGowan, first of all, you've spoken at length with President Lobo about the plans for charter cities, or special development regions, as they're called in Honduras. What is his vision?
Well, he's a very, let's start who he is. He's a very smart president, a very charming wife, very active in what he does, Rosa Lobo. And what I like about him is that his intentions. He seemed really dedicated to change the image of Honduras. They are coming out of this problem that happened with former President Zelaya.
The coup.
The coup.
The democratically elected government was overthrown.
Exactly, and he wants to show Honduras is going toward democracy. And that was a small problem. We got over it, and that we want to be part of these countries that are developing. We don't want to be known as the Honduras where nobody can go because there is too much crime or violence or whatever. He wants to change the image, and he's committed to that. So based on that this idea of the charter cities is a great idea. We can call it the clusters of development. In English, I think sounds better than regiones especiales de desarrollo, because that's what it is. It is this economic laboratory where the best practices will be taken, but only if they have the commitment of everybody that lives in these cities, and only if they are under the same rules. So if it's not a country of laws or a country where people follow the laws, it's not going to work. He knew,
people will leave.
Exactly.
Right.
He knew that the entire country, he couldn't change that.
Okay.
However, you can find a cluster where that utopian economic society, because that's what it is, could have worked. And I think that in the future can work, but at this moment, I don't think they are ready yet.
Karen Spring, then, Maricruz alluded to the political context in Honduras. I mean, help us explore that a bit further. Then, who is Porfirio Lobo? How did he come to power? Who is his main base?
So President Pepe Lobo is he is referred as. He took power after a coup d'état in Honduras. And so his government has been very committed to sort of whitewashing the crimes that were committed during the de facto government that was in power for 5 months and the elections that occurred that brought him to power. And so his government has been very committed to basically hiding what has occurred since the military coup and opening the country up to foreign investment, to give this image that Honduras is very much a place that can be invested in and that foreign companies and investment should consider it a great country to have projects like the model cities. His base support, he's from the National Party, so his base support is the traditional political elite in the country, and so that's where he gets a lot of his support, and his government has been really strongly protested against by the social movement that sort of gained force after the coup.
Interestingly, though, the Congress didn't have much of a problem with passing various constitutional amendments to try and get these charter cities underway, but wasn't the issue of the Constitution, or even actually having a referendum on a non-binding referendum on having a referendum about the Constitution, the reason that Manuel Zelaya, the democratically elected president, was overthrown in the first place?
Right, so there's a lot of contradictions in the way that this project has been presented in Honduras. The people that support it, the people in the Congress representatives are the same people that carried out the military coup and that were in favor of the coup and that brought Pepe Lobo's government to power. So, and they're also the people that will likely benefit from a project such as the model cities. Once again, as they're being protested by social movements that have experienced more of the negative impacts of Pepe Lobo's policies and
what do you mean by
coup
negative
d'etat
impacts?
that happened that was well, I mean, there's negative impacts of the model cities in general. Some of those impacts, the areas where the model cities are being proposed, there's 3 areas, and in every single one of those areas, there are really strong land struggles and land conflicts that have been ongoing for many, many years, for decades, even prior to the military coup. And so what the social movement and what people that are protesting against the Model City project are trying to get across is that a project like the model cities will create even greater land conflict problems for them. And there's just no way of mediating those conflicts that have been ongoing and had really detrimental impacts for the people that inhabit the lands where the model cities are proposed for.
Actually, we have a map of where these charter cities or model cities are planned, as far as we know. The proposed site for the first city is in and around the fishing village of Puerto Castilla on the northeastern coast of Honduras. Official publicity presents it as a sparsely populated region, but the new law allows the government to expropriate land inhabited by impoverished Afro-Caribbean Garifuna communities living in their ancestral lands. The other proposed locations are in the fertile Sula Valley in the north, and there's a third in southern Honduras on the Pacific coast. I'm going to bring Professor Black in a moment, but Maricruz, there was a lot there, and I have a feeling you might have a slightly different view on some of this. But I mean, there is that suspicion that this is a dubious government who is effectively run by a handful of families. Honduras is widely thought to be run by a handful of business families, basically. The model cities solves a number of problems. It makes Honduras look like it's forward-thinking, while sorting out various land conflicts that have been going on for decades, basically, and turfing the poor out.
You got it, because the main problem in the region, let's talk about Latin America, and especially Central America, it's only a few number of families that have been ruling those countries for decades. So anything that they want to do is going to get suspicious with the rest of the
But you're not
country,
suspicious?
because they never, in a way, I really think he wanted to do something nice, but I don't think he even believes that it could be accomplished, to tell you the truth.
Really?
Because he knows his country. I know his country, everybody does, and they are not alone. As I said, they have these elites that they are doing very well with the status quo. So why should they change what they have it?
All right,
They are having a lot of benefits in the way the things are running.
Professor Black, let's dig deeper then into the philosophy underlying charter cities. I mean, part of the reason for them is precisely to sweep away those vested interests and elites, at least according to those who you know, the philosophers behind, the philosopher economists behind these plans. Paul Romer comes to mind. So that question has always been around, that why would the vested interests and elites allow a portion of land to suddenly appear that they have no control over? And so Honduras seems particularly interesting as receptive to this plan, given it is run just by a few families.
Yeah, so there's a complete disconnect between what Paul Romer wants, and by the way, I've worked with Paul Romer since 1993 and have talked to him personally about this idea, and what the oligarchs that control Honduras want. And they simply see this as yet another way to increase their wealth at the expense of other folks. And why would they think that? Because this is not a model city. This is not best practices. This is Ayn Randia, communities that are going to strip away all meaningful governmental power and give all power, not just virtually all power, to the oligarchs. And that's why the oligarchs love the idea. Now, that is not Paul Romer's vision. Paul Romer is a very bright person who has written about the looting that occurs from powerful private parties. His most famous article with George Akerlof is Looting the Economic Underworld of Bankruptcy for Profit. And that is why Paul Romer has resigned, because the project in its reality has nothing to do with the project as Paul Romer conceived it.
But you think this is a particularly Honduran phenomenon, or by its nature, you know, that there are flaws in the charter city model to begin with? Its vision of how the economy and business can run based on good intentions and good faith might be flawed in the first place.
Well, you don't have to call it a flaw, you can call it a risk. So Paul Romer knew from the beginning that there was an enormous risk that if the wrong private actors got in charge, and if they got in charge not through a transparent process, but through backroom deals with corrupt officials and oligarchs, that the result would be catastrophic, that the oligarchs would use it for their own purpose. Remember, we're talking about a nation. There are only 8 nations in the world with greater inequality than Honduras. So this is a place that has been devastated for literally centuries by the oligarchs. But now they have to, you know, there are some laws that get in their way, and they would like to get rid of those laws. So Paul Romer is not naive. He understood that there was this risk, and he thought he had reached an agreement with President Lobo about a process that was going to bring best practices. But Lobo breached that deal, and that's why Romer resigned. And so, you know, one of the other guests said, we need a rule of law. We need best practices. And the ad, of course, talks about picking the best people. None of those things occurred. Quite the opposite occurred. The Supreme Court justices rule against you? Get rid of them. That's not rule of law. That's the destruction of the rule of law. Transparency good? Destroy transparency. Throw out Romer. Bring in the backroom deals. So it's gone wrong from the beginning.
Mary Cruz McGowan, when you spoke to President Lobo and his wife, I mean, did any of this come up, though? I mean, the fact that, you know, internationally, credibility has taken a dent with Paul Romer leaving the project, because what he said was so important. The Transparency Commission to oversee the deals was almost immediately bypassed by the government.
Exactly.
As they made a deal with the MKG group, which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But what hope?
As I said in the beginning, I think President Lobo knew that it was very difficult for this to actually be
But is he
implemented.
naive, or is he actually doing the bidding of those same
Well,
elites?
talking about Professor Romo, I don't think he's naive, but he could be perceived as being a theorist, as somebody that really didn't take into account what country he was talking about. And I'm really sorry to say that. And I would say why? Because when you read the conditions that he has for his model charter cities, it has nothing to do with the reality of Honduras.
Right.
Like everybody will have the same rights, that everybody will obey.
Well, no, but that's exactly
the law.
why you need a charter. In his mind, that's why you need a charter
Yes,
city there, right?
But,
to start again.
But you cannot create such a charter city. That's why I call it a utopian city in a place like Honduras. You are talking about a country that needs to walk toward democracy another 20 years or so before considering something like that. And I don't see that happening yet.
Well, I suppose that's an interesting question, Karen Spring. I mean, they seem to have leapt to this rather revolutionary plan for economic development, but has anyone actually just simply tried representative democracy and equitable economic development? Might not be an easier route to get the whole country moving?
Well, it's, I mean, this is what the Afro-Indigenous and the peasant farmer movements or the small farmer movements that are resisting and opposing the project are trying to do, is that they are demanding more representation and more of a democratic and transparent process. And I mean, and just consultation, and none of that is happening, and it never has happened in Honduras. And I think that the coup in June 2009 is a really good example of how, when someone tries to consult the Honduran population and the interests of the majority are potentially going to be taken into consideration, that the political elite and the economic elite will not allow it. And so any attempt to actually have a democratic process, a transparent process, has had, I mean, this is what the communities have demanded, and they've never been allowed to participate in that. And that, I think Professor Black highlighted that well, that it completely lacks any sort of transparency. And the consequences of this project are much worse in the communities and much worse in the three areas where the project is being proposed for.
Karen, I mean, you did put this into the context then of ongoing land disputes. Much of this land has long been prized by the big landowning families. What do they see there? Are there specific resources on this land? Why has this been so fought over?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think that the letter that Congress member Johnson recently wrote and had 57 signers from congressional representatives sign on to the letter is the attempt to show what are the interests behind this project. And a lot of it has to do with land control, and what does that land control mean for the political and economic elite in Honduras. And the letter, implicitly, if not explicitly, states that there are a lot of other interests that are being incorporated into this project, and these areas happen to be really there's a lot of drug trafficking in these areas. And so land, as in resources, natural resources, especially since it's on two of the locations are on the Caribbean coast. There's a lot of fertile land, and it's also, they're high drug trafficking areas. And so the lack of transparency and the sort of traditional role of the political and economic elite have, and their and the military and police involvement in organized crime and drug trafficking, it sort of brings into question, what are these projects really for? And what are the interests and the people interested in these projects? What is their ultimate goal?
Bill Black, moving away then, briefly then, from the Honduran example, I am interested just to look further into this idea, the concept of charter cities that has inspired this project, apparently. Because it really is something that, from the New York Times Sunday magazine to beloved liberal shows on National Public Radio, This American Life, it gets glowing reviews all the time. And yet, could it work then, do you think, if not happening in a society riven by corruption and violence like Honduras?
Well, you don't need it in other places. So It's actually the old joke about economics that my colleague in studio has just mentioned. Yes, it's true. Paul Romer is an academic, and he has assumed the can opener, as we say in economics. He's assumed the answer to the problem. And you know, that's the fundamental joke in economics that defines the field. So,
right, but fundamental concepts. Oh, go ahead then. Yeah.
I would also add, this is not a democratic movement. Indeed, if you read the writings of Mr. Strong in particular, he is openly hostile to democratic government.
Let me just explain that comment.
It's obsolete.
Michael Strong is the businessman then who is heading this consortium, the MKG group, that has now signed an agreement with the government, we understand. He's refusing, though, to explain who else really is in that consortium, except maybe one Guatemalan businessman I think he's mentioned. Who exactly is Michael Strong? What's his philosophy? Actually, interestingly, he's part of some wider rich man's libertarian movement in the U.S. I think he's often connected to the CEO of Whole Foods, where a lot of well-meaning liberals get their groceries, actually. But what's the philosophy behind all of this?
That's right. That's Mr. Mackey. So the philosophy behind this in economics, this is called Austrian economics, and it is tremendous hostility not only to government but to the entire concept of democratic decision-making, which they see as inherently coercive and therefore inherently backed up by the military and guns. And in contrast, they say, private decision-making is inherently voluntary and almost inherently beneficial. I would note that, again, Paul Romer is one of the key economists saying that last part is not true at all, that if you get rid of the governmental function, the rule of law, you will produce crony capitalism and disasters. But so for Strong, he sees this, as I said, as Ayn Randia. This is a place where there would be virtually no government, virtually no governmental restrictions, where there would be many, many states or cities that would be independent. Some of his followers want to create artificial islands and boats that would be sovereign.
Well, let me bring Mary Cruz McGowan
throughout the world.
Because I think as an economist then, even though I think you seem to have suggested that you're aware of the problems in Honduras,
yes.
You did seem quite optimistic about the chance of this model working. But what is that based on? For example, that idea that people will vote with their feet if the business elites running these enclaves aren't running things well. I mean, do you really believe that they won't simply have to basically go there because there's no other economic development in the region, and there won't simply be slums, for example?
Exactly. You have nothing and you have this.
Right.
And great things always started with great ideas. And I think this is a great idea. However, you will need to empower the non-elites, which is most of the country, in order for this to work. And another point that Karen touched that is very important is what is happening with the drug trafficking. So when I talk about economics, I am an economist, but I am also a realist, and you cannot divorce economics from politics.
Right.
And you have to ask yourself, what's the incentive of staying with what they have, and what's the incentive of doing something new, which is what Professor Romer is proposing. And right now, there is not enough incentive to go into something new.
Right, but the only example...
But the idea is good.
But the only example of this ever sort of working that's trotted out by Paul Romer and others is of Hong Kong.
Yes.
Suggesting, well, this was a charter city. But many have pointed out that there's a fundamental misreading of the history of Hong Kong there, given that its charter only came under charter after it was well on its way to economic development and most of the infrastructure had already been built.
Well, Hong Kong has a completely different story
but that's the only example they can show
Honduras.
of laissez-faire capitalism working in the way that's imagined, isn't it?
More or less. They have one of the highest income inequalities.
Right, but
so it's working for some, but it's not working for most of them.
Right.
And that's Hong Kong.
So are you for this or against it, Mary Cruz?
Well, I am for starting with a good idea.
Right.
But I am not for trying to get it right now, because the elites are going to also hijack this idea, turn it around, and turn it into something that will benefit them. That's why I am against. I am for the idea, but against implementing it right now under the current conditions.
Mary Cruz McGowan, thank you very much. Karen Spring, thank you. Professor Bill Black, thank you very much as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.